Hi, welcome to Talk About the Passion. I'm your host, Christian Campagna, and on this episode, one of my dear friends, Michael Brousseau, returns to talk music with me. Michael was on one of the original episodes, number 4, if I'm not mistaken. I'm definitely not mistaken, as I just checked, but it feels nice to say sometimes. I even stroked my chin as I said it. On this episode, we talk about revisiting things loved as a kid, before you met that person who got you into the cool stuff, like a neighbor, a family friend, that cool kid at school that knew all the new bands. And then, we pretty much start there and have a pretty loose conversation about music, the experience of discovery, attaching good and bad memories to music, and one of the common themes on this podcast, just not having guilty pleasures. I really enjoyed this. Michael moved from Providence to California a while back, so it was nice to catch up with him, but also share some of his insights on listening to music with you. I love talking to Mike about music. He's done a number of tattoos on me, so, in addition to getting some great artwork by him, it was always a good excuse to talk about everything from, Pavement to Outkast over a few hours. Michael also has a great podcast called Gleaming the Tube, where him and longtime friend Kevin Cafferty talk about movies that involve skateboarding. Kevin is an encyclopedia of film. He was on this podcast early on as well. And Michael is an encyclopedia on skateboarding, so it's interesting to hear them talk, and it's a funny podcast. I'd give it a listen if I were you. There's a bunch of episodes. They're short, and I know you'll binge them. One more thing before we get going. Two more things, actually. First is, when I do these conversations, I say yeah a lot. Sometimes three times in like a 2-second span of time. Most of the last, 50 episodes or so are recorded as 2 tracks, so when I edit them, I mute myself. This recording, however, was done as 1 track, so I apologize for that in advance. It just means I have a great guest that I'm, agreeing with them so much. Secondly, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. Just look for Talk About the Passion podcast, and you'll find me, I swear. If you like what you hear, subscribe where you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Well, that's it for me. This one's a long one, but lots of fun. So here we go with episode 92. Thanks for listening. So, hello, I am here with Michael Brousseau for the second time on the podcast.
Hello.
How's it going, man?
Very, very good, man. Thank you.
And you were on one of like the single digit episode, it might have been like the 3rd or 4th episode of this podcast you were on.
Oh, really?
So.
I didn't realize it was that early on.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah. And there's been other people that have been on multiple times, and I think it's a crime that you're not one of them. So I'm glad we're doing that again, because we've most of the times we've hung out the last few times has been you zapping me with a tattoo needle. And
yes.
We've always had. And there's been times where I'm like, this conversation would have been great to record.
Yeah.
But it's also better left to just like 2 friends talking about music. So.
Right, when I'm not singing idiotic songs.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea for this was the last few years you were talking about you've been revisiting things you loved as a kid, sort of before the influence of like other people sort of came into your life. So sort of go into that, like how like what do you mean about that?
Well, it's I don't know exactly where. I think you get to a certain age,
mm-hmm.
and you just start sort of like revisiting the things that you were into when you were a kid. But I also think that, I was thinking a lot about this in the lead up to talking about this. And I was also thinking about how there's an element of social media where, you become self-aware enough of who you are, and you sort of like the outward personality that you put out there because of social media. If you're any kind of a self-aware person, you cringe at a post you made 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about like, well, what is that? Like, what is it about like your, like a tone or a sort of a or like a narrative you're trying to create on social
Yeah.
media
Yeah.
that makes it so a couple of years, and it's every couple of years, you're like, what
Yeah.
the fuck? Like, why was I talking that way? And I started thinking about how, that there is that concept of like Facebook behavior.
Yeah.
And then I just started to think about like, the kind of behavior and the kind of stuff that you do and think about before you're sort of like even like a fully formed human being. I'm not even talking about like early teens. I'm talking pre that, like 10 or 11 years old, when you're like this, still in this weird embryonic stage of a person, and the stuff that you respond to before you are responding to it. And it's entirely possible I'm only talking about me here, but I doubt it. It's the stuff that you respond to before you know that there's stuff you're supposed to like and stuff that you're not supposed to like.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea, and I'm fascinated by the idea of like where that aesthetic comes from. Like, why is it that when you're in like third, fourth, fifth grade, all of a sudden one kid hears Metallica and that's it. They're like, chemically, they react to fucking Metallica. And another kid hears LL Cool J. And another kid, like, or later on down the line, like a kid sees a Juggalo and was like, yep, that's for like, and what is that? And because I think it's been especially acute over the last couple of years, because I sort of breached through this weird level where all of a sudden the stuff, it's basically movies, where all of a sudden the stuff that I'm listening to didn't need to be 100% curated at all times. I worked at a tattoo shop for 20 years.
Right.
And me and I owned the last tattoo shop I worked at, and the kid that I worked with he was one of those, he was like a true explorer. And we talked about this all the time. Like, he was just younger than me enough that like when he heard Limp Bizkit for the first time, they were the shit.
Yeah.
And I was just old enough to know that they were shit.
Right.
But then I started thinking about like, well, what about this stuff that like all of this shit that I loved before before I was under the influence of anybody else. And of course, when you're a little kid, there are influences. You're just way less aware of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so on the idea of like living a sort of a much less musically curated life, for the last maybe the last year at the shop, we would just put on like regular rock radio.
Yeah.
Or if I was in my car, instead of fiddling around with my fucking iPhone, I would just put on 94 HJY.
Right.
And I would hear a song that I had heard. Like, I remember talking about this. This is one of the first things that I think I posted about on Facebook, where out of the blue, it was the millionth time I had heard the song Sister Golden Hair by America. But it just gutted me. Because because it was a completely uncurated thing. It just played randomly. It fired off like a different synapse in my head, where I was like, how is it that I've heard this song?
Yeah.
I mean, it's Sister Golden Hair, but it never, all of a sudden it affected me in a certain way. And I started trying to sort of it sounds a little bit, you just get to an age where you're sort of more psychologically prepared to think about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
You actually do a little talk therapy, and you start having real life experiences that are heavier than just a show you went to, or getting dumped by somebody.
Right.
And you start to I just started getting really weirdly open to the idea of like, well, why is it that when I was a kid at 11, if you had asked me what my favorite band is, I would have told you Simple Minds.
Yeah.
But why haven't I thought about Simple Minds?
Right. Yeah.
And it's almost like it's like the reverse of discovering brand new music. Because I'm still a huge fan of discovering new music, but I'm really become a fan of like, seriously, just being like, well, why haven't I thought about the Pet Shop Boys,
right?
That another one of those bands. And I was thinking a lot about how there was, the huge influence of MTV on that.
Yeah.
Where there were certain things that I heard that just, like I said, just like the Juggalo kid, I was like, yup. and it was a lot of weird sort of like Europop, like In Excess and Simple
Yeah,
Minds.
In Excess. I was literally just going to say
Right.
In
Oh my
Excess.
God. Are you kidding me
Because
with
their
In
videos,
Excess?
like,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
one
Well,
thing,
Devil
and then the
Inside. Are
later
you
ones.
kidding
Yeah,
me? There's
Devil Inside.
there's a kid who does the rail slide. The rail slide in Devil Inside has come up probably on like so I do a podcast about movies with skateboarding in it. And I think the rail slide in the video for Devil Inside has come up like 10 times because it was this. And there's a pro skater who was just interviewed in Thrasher as a little aside, but he mentioned the video for Devil Inside. I'm like, yeah, dude, it was one rail slide, but in that time, that was, as far as skate media goes, that was it. It's like I would literally sit in my living room for hours waiting for the video because he also had that cool jacket with the devil on the back of it. But yeah, it really started making me think about like, where does that stuff like maybe if I were a more fully formed person, I would have like just held on to that stuff.
Right.
But because, of teenage or early teen, self-consciousness or stuff, when I realized that it's possible that Simple Minds wasn't the fucking coolest band to be into, I was like, oh no, I'm way more into the Dead Kennedys. But now at 47, I'm like, New Gold Dream? Are you kidding me? Put that record on. It's amazing. Yeah, totally. And it's just been this weird like thing that I'm aware of lately.
Yeah.
Has that been the truth for you too? Or
like one of those songs that happened to me with a few years ago is that Jerry Rafferty song, Right Down the Line.
Oh my God, that song. That's
because I had heard that like sort of like in the in the doctor's office. People say the elevator, but I don't think I've ever even heard music in an elevator. Maybe
it's definitely on the way home from the bank with your mom. Music, absolutely.
Yeah, but I heard it one day, and it was in California, literally on like the Pacific Coast Highway, and it's like a perfect song for that.
Yeah, it's perfect.
And it was just like I was like, wow, this is just a perfect rock.
It's a fucking good song. There's another one. I think it's by that one's Jerry Rafferty, right? Maybe it's Little River Band. There's a song called "Woman."
Oh,
I think that I don't remember. It might be Little River Band, but I heard again same scenario. It came on the radio, and I was like, God damn! Like, and that was the other one that I still it's a go to constantly, and I don't remember. I think it was used in a movie or something. But the song "Diamond Girl" by Seals and Croft.
Oh yeah.
That fucking song is a juggernaut, man. And like again, it's a song I've heard, a million times in my life. But all of a sudden, one night, I just heard it in the right. It hit me the right way.
Yeah.
It got me thinking a lot about when I was a kid. It's so funny to think about like. I remember identifying this as sort of a thought in my early 20s where like, it's like the kids that you gravitate towards in like 5th and 6th grade before you've named the punk rock kids are always, I was certainly one of the weirdo kids.
Oh yeah. Same.
Like, but I had it was like, I knew that I liked, I mean, obviously, let's face it, Weird Al Yankovic was, a touchstone for a lot of people a lot of kids of a certain disposition. But I remember, it's funny, I was thinking about it, I was really like protective of that. I wasn't a sharer.
Yeah.
I went to a little Catholic school. There was like 25 kids in my class, and they were the same kids from kindergarten to 6th grade.
Oh, wow.
And I remember I had gotten a taste for Bloom County. Which I'm sure I've touched on Bloom County in other conversations because that was a huge one for me. But Bloom County, Mad Magazine, Weird Al Yankovic, and and then maybe just at like 12, I skirted into like Monty Python territory.
Oh yeah.
And who those kids are.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You know what I mean? Like but I was really protective of it. I didn't. It was like source material for me, so I wouldn't share it. I remember one day a kid came in with a Mad Magazine, and he was like showing it around the class. And I was like, "Whoa, dude! Like, hey, that's a secret text. You gotta like,
I know.
You gotta keep your powder dry with that." But but I always think about like how as I got a little older, the people that I was always the most drawn to were the people who were sharers and who were not the kind of kids who sort of wanted to be like this sort of scorched earth thing where they discovered punk rock, and then there was this kid, there's this dude. I'm going to shout out to Rick Almeida. He's come up in a bunch of different podcasts. I probably even talk about him in the last episode.
That we did. Yeah,
he was the older kid who was just one of those fully formed human beings.
Yeah.
And he was the classic sort of like 80s skater punk rock dude with the trench coat and the army pants and the Tony Hawk haircut. But
Christian Slater would have played him in a movie.
Yes, exactly. And he was the kid. He was a couple of years older than me, and he was the kid who started plying me with mixtapes.
Oh, nice.
But almost like offensively good fucking taste in music. And I think about it at the time. This kid was 14 when I was 12.
Yeah.
He was handing me mixtapes that had like the Go-Go's and the Dead Kennedys and Public Enemy.
Yeah.
He even weirdly introduced me into like, it's funny, he introduced me to Youth Crew shit and the joke Youth Crew shit at the same time. Like I heard Youth of Today and Crucial Youth together. And him trying to explain to me like, so here's the thing.
Right.
There are these bands, but then there's also these joke bands. I was like, what the fuck? Like what? But he would hand me these I remember it was one of the mixtapes that he gave me. It's such a funny personality thing between me and Liam. Like he gave me a mixtape and it had a lot of Youth Crew stuff and a lot of like 80s hardcore, like Dead Kennedys and 7 Seconds. And I remember, I think I let Liam borrow the tape to dub it. And Liam came away a dyed in the wool 7 Seconds fan.
Yeah.
And I came away like a huge Dead Kennedys fan.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I think a lot about the Dead Kennedys because I think the reason that I gravitated towards them is because a lot of the stuff I heard prior to that was supposed to be shocking punk rock music fell a little lame to me. And I only mean like, I think I had a copy of London Calling.
Right.
And at the time I was too young. I was like, this sounds like Bruce Springsteen.
Right.
Like it doesn't, it didn't resonate with me the way, but I heard the Dead Kennedys. I think I heard Police Truck and I was like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, who the fuck are these guys? And it's funny because a couple of years later, I think that Jello has a tendency to sort of wear his welcome where you're like, I did. Like, maybe calm the fuck down. But at the time, that was some of the first stuff that I really gravitated to. But it's funny because that was the stuff where I was under the influence of another person.
Right.
It's the stuff pre that I've become really, really obsessed with. We've had this conversation where I had, a pretty traumatic experience happen to me a couple of years ago. And in the aftermath of trying to sort of make sense of it, I started listening to Steely Dan.
Yeah.
Because my mother, I think so, it makes me laugh so hard. My mother was this like Steely Dan super fan. She fucking loved the Dan.
Yeah.
And at 12 or 13, when I'm just starting to like, I had a penchant for like hip hop. I liked Run DMC and I liked LL Cool J, but I had just started butting up against all this punk rock stuff. And we would drive around and listen to, to Steely Dan, and it couldn't have been any lamer. Like, how the fuck are you going to listen to Kid Charlemagne? But now I go back and I listen to Kid Charlemagne, and I'm like, my mother was spot on.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I think my favorite thing about it is, and maybe this is just like, another 35 years of life lessons. I think my favorite thing about my fandom of Steely Dan is that I no longer feel like I need to be like the resident Steely Dan expert.
Right.
I don't.
There's a lot of them out there.
And the thing is, like, I get it. I know that there's a lot of digging to be done with the Dan, but like, as almost as like a ceremonial show of that, I just bought the greatest hits.
Oh yeah.
I bought what is it? Not Swing Kids. What is it called?
Showbiz Kids. Yeah.
And it's like 25 tracks. I was like, this is fine. This is deep. I like the Dan. I'm not going to become
right.
And even there, it's funny because even that has a self-awareness where I'm like, well, maybe I should just become a Dan.
Yeah.
But like my knee-jerk reaction wasn't to suddenly have to become like a scholar on Steely Dan. I just like that band and I enjoy them. It's funny, in the time that I've been in LA, I got a job as a delivery driver.
Mm-hmm.
And again, same deal. I'm not going to futz around with playlists on my phone.
Right.
I discovered like 2 or 3 different decent
Radio
stations.
yeah.
And I just like, there's one called Jack FM, which is really, there's one called KLOS that has real DJ. It's like a real radio station.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember.
And the other one is like a canned voice thing with a kind of a radio personality, but like the Jack, they just play, it's great. They just play some Cure, some New Order, some REM, and then they'll always sort of throw in kind of there's a certain level of irony, I think, to some of the play, like, they'll play like Lisa Lisa. Not that Lisa Lisa and Nicole Jam isn't awesome, but you can tell they're like, oh, well, it's the whole station ideas. We'll play what we want.
Yeah.
And it's great. You drive around, you're like, oh, I have like what was the song? It's My Life by Talk Talk.
Oh yeah.
I mean, holy shit. Like Talk Talk, like, that was like their big hit.
Yeah. And
one day I was driving and it was on. I was like, oh, I know, like, I became a fan of Talk Talk much later on.
Yeah.
Based on an article they did in Mojo about Spirit of Eden.
Yeah, because they're like totally different than that. Like there's that song, and then there's these albums with like 15-minute songs. And,
they had the one hit. And it's funny, the one hit buys you another 5 albums if you want. And I had forgotten about the fucking single It's My Life. And then I realized, like, No Doubt covered it. And that's,
I like that cover actually.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. Like, I don't know. It's funny. It's like, I guess really the subject we're talking about is like, when you get to a certain point when you just sort of like can let your guard down a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
And just sort of like shit.
Yeah.
And about how when you're a kid, you don't have your guard up. Well, at least I didn't, you know?
Yeah.
And I remember I was always fascinated as a kid when I would meet someone who wasn't like that. I kind of touched on that earlier, but like there was a few people. There was that kid, Rick Almeida, who just like he was the polymath. He had all the different taste in music.
Yeah.
And then I met this kid named Mike Garno from Woonsocket, who was like the most perfect looking English punk kid. Yeah. He was so pointy and he had like the pointy spiky hair. And he was like, those kids who like, when they get into a thing, they know they get way into it. Like they get the right jacket.
Oh yeah.
Cause like there is that. It's like I was always the kid who was like, oh, I'll try on this different hat. It was always like the wrong, not quite the right hat. It wasn't until I kind of fell in. It wasn't until I fell into like sort of hip hop skater style that I sort of found. But I was always the kid wearing like the weird shirt I found in the garbage or whatever. Yeah. But this kid Mike was like, he was like this fully formed punk rock kid. He's chain built and everything. But when I went into it, like his house the first time, and I went into his room, I thought it was really, really cool that there was evidence of his other tastes all over the place. Like this kid is a born rocker. I have a friend who went to elementary school with him, and there are literally photos of this kid with like Iron Maiden folders in first grade. Like that's awesome. He's like sort of a dyed in the wool rock and roll kid. Yeah. But at the time he looked like Sid Vicious. Yeah. But we went into his room and he had like the Kiss dolls and posters of like Frank Zappa and Wasp or whatever on his walls. And I remember he was the first kid I knew who had like a real legitimate sizable record collection.
Nice.
And I remember flipping through his records and I was like, oh, like he doesn't feel like he needs to do that thing where it's like, well, I'm into this now, so I'm going to jettison all my fucking Todd Rundgren records or whatever. He had it all, and he was like, oh, you should listen to this. And I thought, and I always thought that was really, really cool. But I can also report that I did not take away from that the right thing, which was just be who. Like at the time, I was a really, really kind of self-conscious kid, and but it's funny because I recognized that was a super cool thing.
Oh yeah.
But I just wasn't up for it yet. I still had my shit,
Yeah. When I was getting into punk and hardcore, the guy that got me into it, who was on episode 1 of this podcast, Peter Biebergall, who's now like a successful author and just like a brilliant guy, but he's the one that got me into punk rock. And I remember one day I showed up at his house and I went to like some store and I bought a pin that said punk And it was like it was literally like a
So
British
amazing.
flag, and the punk was in like ransom letters, and it was like a safety pin, and he's like, "No, don't wear that." I was like, "Okay, okay."
I'm
He's
sorry,
like,
man.
"Wear this."
Well,
Yeah, yeah,
I was thinking about that today. I remember when, you have these weird ideas of like what a punk rock kid is
yeah.
from like movies. I
Right.
remember I always gravitated towards, in like the 80s comedy, there's always like the wacky
Oh
friend who
yeah,
wears like sunglasses in
yeah,
class.
yeah, yeah,
Like that. I always gravitated. I
yeah,
always wanted to be that kid with the
yeah.
whole fucking Hawaiian shirt.
Oh yeah,
And I remember like I remember sort of like walking around my neighborhood doing this like test run
yeah,
for like punk rock Mike. But all it was is that I had found an army issue shirt
yeah,
that was big enough that I wore it as a jacket.
yeah.
And I had covered it in pins, but they were just the pins I had lying
Just
around
that
my
just happened to
house.
have, yeah.
You know what I mean? It wasn't like at that point, I wasn't even like, oh, I'll go to a record store and buy a
Right,
bunch of pins. It was like, it was literally like a reading is fundamental
right, like a
pin. And like
Chevy pin or something.
exactly like whatever my dad had like a
Right.
drawer full of like ephemera and stuff. And I was like, oh, I'll take that. And it was,
The
it's
Pawtucket
so,
Red Sox.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's so funny to think like that. It's like I was like going through the motions, but it's like I didn't quite know what it was yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when I went, finally I went to public school, which is a huge cultural shift for me.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that's when I met I met other kind of skater
Yeah.
punk rock
Cooler
kids.
kids. Yeah.
And it's funny. I always say this. It's one of those things where like I think a lot of people tend to have this idea that they were born in the wrong time.
Yeah.
But man, was I right there.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I
late
think
80s,
you and
early
I,
90s,
yeah.
safe as a kitten. Everything was like
Yeah.
everything was as cool as it could possibly be. And I was right
Yeah.
there to,
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think like hardcore at that point was finally starting to like branch out to different stuff, like
sure.
Verbal Assault and Soul Side and bands like that. And then it was word of mouth. And then like into the 90s, we had college radio, and it was like a wealth of indie rock, hip hop.
Oh, yeah.
Just all this stuff came together, and like we were, it was ripe for the picking
Sure,
for us.
yeah. There was a radio show we could pick up on Friday nights. I don't remember what college it was from, but it was called Metro Wave Hardcore.
Yeah.
And it was a kid who would play it, and it was like the first, I gravitated more towards, I don't even know if I would say I gravitated more towards punk rock, because really what I mean when I say that is the Dead Kennedys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like most of the other stuff I was into was not quite in that same realm, but
yeah,
that was the first show where he would play, Minor Threat. And
okay, yeah.
I remember hearing Uniform Choice. I remember he played Uniform Choice, but it was the new Uniform Choice.
Oh, really?
With
Yeah.
long hair.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a song called Indian Eyes. And he played it and like couldn't help but like make fun of it on the air. And I remember listening to him and being like, wow, this kid's already like a jaded college student. I'm like 14, just trying to like figure out like, what bands I should be into. And
Yeah.
It's funny. This is a total aside, but now that I brought it up,
Mhm.
I remember one of the first, it might have been the second show I ever went to.
Yeah.
Liam and I went to see Corrosion of Conformity on an afternoon show. Was the first show.
Yeah.
And then the band, that band DI.
Oh yeah.
Remember DI? They were playing.
Yeah.
And it was a night show. How the fuck I ended up at a night show? I was like 14. It was like club
Baby.
the Rocket.
The Rocket.
It was the Rocket.
Yeah,
it was
when it was the Rocket. Yeah.
And I remember there was a kid there that I had seen around a little bit on like College Hill and the kind of the cool kid area of Thayer Street. He was my age and he was at the show, and the band DI came out, and they were of some note. I know that they were a pretty big deal. Like a East Bay band or
they were Orange County, and it was
Orange County.
They were sort of an offshoot of the Adolescents, and they had a song in the Suburbia movie.
That's right.
Richard hung himself, but they had a couple. I think they have like 3 good records, like 2 really good ones.
I remember their record covers actually having like it looked like there was a budget.
Yeah, they were terrible.
But he came out and like they he made some comment, and this kid, his name was Joe, and he was like, I fucking hate these guys already. And I was like, oh my God, you have an opinion already? Like, how like, I'm like literally just like amazed that I'm in this room and wondering, like at that point, I still thought the pit was an actual sunken in area in front of the stage for go in the pit. And this kid's already like jaded, like, oh, what? I was like, I remember he was smoking a cigarette. He was like, oh, well, this fucking guy sucks. I was like, holy shit, dude. Like, what are you, 35? Like, I want to have some of them opinions.
I know. You were on a message board in 2002.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
Yeah. It was funny. Yeah.
And how younger people consume music now. And I was talking about this last night on the one I did with Damien. And when we were getting into stuff, it was word of mouth, fanzines and skate videos. You said a lot of guys I've talked to in here have discovered stuff through that. But do you think it's much different nowadays how kids are discovering stuff?
It's like, it's almost like exactly the same thing, just on a much speedier.
Yeah.
Like I feel like there's a much quicker overlap between, oh, I'd like to hear this and I'm hearing it. Right. You just Google it. It's just there.
Yeah.
Or you go, but I think honestly, I think it's the same thing. It's just the machinations have changed. Like I remember on one of my very first trips to Thayer Street, I bought Sonic Youth's Confusion is Sex.
Yeah.
And I'm here to tell you that I think the only reason I bought that record was because I had heard the name Sonic Youth.
Right. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is, and I also remember, it's so funny to think like the elixir of the gods at the time was that the kid behind the counter didn't get, he was like, Sonic Youth. And I was like, oh, okay. I've got taste in reality. It just was like the cool looking cover that I took home. But it became, it becomes that, right? You exchange some mixtapes. There's stuff that you like. My favorite thing is my favorite covenant is the mixtape with no track listings.
Oh yeah, you just
my friend Rick never pulled that shit with me. But there was other times where you be like, well, figure it out for yourself. If you like it.
You'd be like, thanks, man.
Thanks, great. I guess I'll just go fuck myself.
Right.
But yeah, I remember having this and then of course I did not like that Sonic Youth record when I found it didn't sound great to me.
That wouldn't be a good one to
it wasn't a great starting point. I also it's funny, I think about this all the time. One of the coolest moves my dad ever made was when I was really young. I was probably 10 and I found a book about the Velvet Underground.
Okay.
Well, it was about Andy Warhol.
Oh yeah,
and the whole factory scene, and of course there was all those cool black and white photos of him and the Velvets all wearing like wraparound sunglasses and looking like the fucking coolest people that you could ever imagine. And I remember it because and I was like, that was like my first thing I knew. I was like, well, they used to be called the Exploded Plastic Inevitable, but then so my dad, believe it or not, there was a record store at the Lincoln Mall near where I grew up that was a decent record store. It had. You could buy like a Dead Kennedy shirt or, there was decent shit. Yeah. And my dad brought me there and was like, I couldn't stop talking about the fucking Velvet Underground. And I was like, well, let's get you, it's your birthday. So I got a copy of the record with the banana on the cover. Yeah. And I hated it. It was like, nothing that I gave it a spin. 10? I was 10 or maybe I was turning 11.
Right.
Maybe
still,
but even still, not prepared for that at all. And I just put that away. And it was just like I had much better luck with the mixtapes. I remember there was one of the mixtapes was most of Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death.
Oh yeah, the singles.
And there were two very distinct moments where the record that had been recorded off of skipped.
Oh, nice.
But it skipped in a way. If you're not familiar with the music, I didn't know. It wasn't like an obvious skip. It was like a skip that like skipped a whole line.
Yeah.
You know that song, Who's That Kid in the Back of the Room? Who's that? Whatever that. I can't remember the name of the song, but there was this very definitive skip. And to this day, when I hear the real version of the song, it bugs me because I'm like,
that it doesn't. Yeah.
It's supposed to have that weird.
That happened to me like a month ago. I went and I bought a bunch of records and I got a Nazareth record. And I had known like a couple songs on it, but I didn't really know the record. And I was cooking in the kitchen, and there's a part in the song where it's a drum, sort of like a little, it's probably a 5 or 10 second little drum solo. And that must have went on for 4 minutes. And I just thought like, oh, it's a record from the 70s. They would always do shit like that. It's just random, boring drum solo in the middle. And then like finally I was like, wait, I think this is skipping. So.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it sounds like it must have been a pretty cool 4-minute drum solo before your brain picked up on that. Like, oh shit, that's not right. Yeah.
Now,
that's funny.
Did you ever have periods where you were into stuff and you were kind of embarrassed to, admit that you liked it?
To be honest with you, I think I got over that kind of quick. I think it's interesting because the first records that I bought that I, other than Weird Al was the first thing. That was like, I mean, come on. Yeah. I don't know how what kind of person you have to be to hear Weird Al Yankovic and not be like, well, this is the greatest artist of our time. I certainly felt that way. So I picked up. In fact, that was like one of my first like weird record collector moments where I got it in 3D.
Oh yeah.
And then the record that came out after in 3D. Oh no, sorry. Was in 3D the third record?
Maybe.
Whatever. I had the two. I had the one with the in 3D, and I had the one with I Lost on Jeopardy or whatever. Whatever the record was. Whatever those two records were.
Yeah.
And then we went. This is such a suburban experience, but we went to a different mall. Sometimes you're with your family somewhere and you're somehow at a fucking different mall.
Yeah, and you're like, oh my God, this.
Yeah. Oh, a different tape store, and the tape store I had no idea that there was a first Weird Al Yankovic record.
Yeah, that's funny. Which
is the one with My Bologna that's literally recorded in the fucking men's room, like that record.
Yeah.
And it's such a cool move of my dad. Same with the Velvet Underground record. It's like it was not my birthday.
Yeah.
It was not anywhere near Christmas, and I just walked up to him with this like $9 Weird Al, and I was like, well, I have to have this. And he was like, okay, you just bought it for me.
Yeah.
And I was like, and then it sort of plays into to me being almost like withholding. Like I didn't tell people about the first. I was like, I've got the first Weird Al record. But so after that, like I said, I bought like a Run DMC tape. Yeah. And the LL Cool J tape was the big one. I must have listened to Bigger and
Radio.
Deffer.
Oh, Bigger and Deffer.
Bigger and Deffer. That was like right when I was 12.
Yeah.
Maybe a little younger. But I heard it. I heard some older skater kids listening to it. And I was like, well, it was my birthday. And I was like, I'm buying it. And holy shit, I must have listened to that record. So it's I think the only time, to answer your actual question, I was sort of a secret fan of hip hop.
Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah.
While we were dabbling into punk rock stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't mean like if I went to a school dance, I was sure as hell dancing to Joy and Pain by Rob Basie rock. But like it was like those are because we had Walkmans at the time, and that was something I kind of kept to myself, or at least I thought I had to keep to myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then there was that weird, all of a sudden, like skateboarding and rap music started getting kind of like there was like an East Coast presence,
right? That
was way more into hip hop. We sure didn't call it hip hop at the time,
right? Yeah,
it was just rap music. But like, and then I remember. So this is a little later on. Like all of a sudden there was like hip hop that you listen to like Tribe and De La Soul, and it's stuff that, let's face it, you can dig into a little more.
Oh yeah.
And I remember almost like sort of coming out to like being like, actually, I'm going to all these shows, and I do like a lot of this stuff, but really in my Walkman, I'm always listening to hip hop. And then and the other thing too, I think maybe I kept it a little close to the breast, that maybe in the mid 90s, I was really into like electro, like house music and jungle break and stuff like that. And that was like, and this sort of is the kind of harkens back to the model of the fully formed kid, where by that time I didn't feel like I needed to like have a rave outfit.
Right.
I would
Yeah, of
go,
course.
it became, and that has a lot to do with Providence, where it's such a small space
Yeah.
that you're going to go to a rave and see the kid
Oh yeah.
who hated DI
Right.
was at
Right.
the rave
Oh
too.
yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so was there's the guy from Drop Dead is also at a
Right.
rave. Maybe I shouldn't say, I don't know if Ben or anybody was ever actually at a rave. I picked that name out of thin air. But what I'm saying
Yeah.
is those people were always at the same functions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it felt a lot less like you had to have
Yeah. Yeah.
like guilty pleasures. I
Yeah.
remember the first time I actually sort of like kicked against the idea of a guilty pleasure. And I mean, this was pretty deep in my kind of wannabe music snob
Yeah.
mid-20s, which is when that's all about,
Yeah.
swinging your dick around and letting everybody know that you.
Right.
But I remember I worked at a bar and the song Hey Baby by No Doubt came on.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, huh, this is a fucking No Doubt song. It's, it's produced by Rick Ocasek.
Yeah.
And it's a fucking monster of a song.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, all right, I don't need to roll my eyes.
Right. Right.
Pretend that I'm not, I'm fucking into this.
Yeah,
it's
a
awesome.
good song.
It's
Yeah.
a fucking good song. And I think at that point, I'm sure I had some angle where I was trying to be like, more evolved than some other,
Right.
which of course, we're still in that miasma of trying to prove yourself. But I dispensed with that notion pretty quickly and just was like, I'll kind of like what I like,
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I found some old pictures recently, and there's a picture of me at Disneyland, and I'm wearing a John Coltrane shirt. And I'm like, it's like from 1993. I'm like, I'm wearing a Stussy baseball hat that had like a Martin Luther King pin on it, and a John Coltrane shirt.
Perfect. Yeah.
A goatee and
there's a photo that haunts me of like, I remember it was like, in the run up to the first day of school, we would always go and get new school clothes.
Yeah.
And there was a store, it was like a discount department store in Pawtucket called Ann and Hope.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had those up in North Shore too.
They always had like big bins full of t-shirts. And one of the ones I chose, totally arbitrary, was like a tie-dyed Grateful Dead t-shirt.
Yeah. And
for years I would like, it's like a picture, it's like such the quintessential 80s picture of me skateboard and like the Life's a Beach hat, but I wouldn't want anybody to see it because I was in a Dead shirt. Now I'm like, who gives a shit? Like at the time, I probably had never heard a note of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
It was just a shirt that was $3 in the bin. And I was like, all right, that works. It's funny. I have the other really funny memory I have of that is like, I was kind of touching on this earlier, how there's like always seems to be people in any new scene or any new sort of experience you're having who like got there first and figured out what was cool and what wasn't cool.
Yeah.
I remember the very first rave I ever went to, I had no idea, I was wearing like Dickies and a t-shirt,
right.
And of course it was the kid who was already decked out in like the full Adidas jump, the suit and had the right shoes and the Kangol. I was like, holy fuck, like this dude, like I didn't get the newsletter this kid got. But my favorite example of that is that when I was in 7th grade. So I was like 12 or 13. And to me, the coolest shirt that I had was a Bill the Cat shirt where he's dressed up like a heavy metal guy and it says, I sold my soul for rock and roll. I was like, how like that shirt, my uncle got it for me, and I think he had to mail order it, and it was beamed out of like, in my head, I was like, this is the coolest t-shirt anyone has ever worn. And then I met up with a big group of skateboarder kids in downtown Woonsocket and immediately started getting my cards pulled about the shirt. And I was like, what do you mean, sir? Are you unfamiliar with the adventures of Bill the Cat and the other folks from Bloom County? And this kid was like, because it wasn't a Life's a Beach streetwear shirt. He was like, "But what's with your lame shirt?" I was like, "Oh man, like." And it's unfortunate. I wish I was the other kid who was like, "Go fuck yourself, man." That's awesome. But I wasn't. I was like, "Oh man, I guess I got to go get rid of my Bill the Cat shirt."
I know. I had a lot of questionable in the '90s. There's pictures. Some of them I've had destroyed, but I had like although at this point I kind of wish I had a Luscious Jackson shirt that I used to wear all the time. A House of Pain shirt. Like,
hey man, the House of Pain, they were gonna bring it to you. It's funny. Whenever once in a while stuff like that comes up, like an old friend will post a photo, and it's always the accessories for me.
Yeah. Oh,
By
yeah.
the time I was like 19, I had settled into,
Yeah.
like Dickies style pants,
Yeah.
Vans or Pumas,
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
typical 90s, but
Yeah.
there was always an unfortunate
Yeah.
choker necklace or a big beaded, that was like one of the first phases I got into. And it was like, I didn't realize it was essentially the rave scene.
Yeah.
That fucking song "Groove Is in the Heart" came out.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all that sort of retro disco style.
Yeah.
And of course, like I went to the Salvation Army and got every ugly ass, because the Beastie Boys had the
Hey Ladies
the
video.
Hey Ladies video. That was my shit. When I was in when I was in 7th or 8th grade, it was all about the whole now eventually that sort of bumped into the rave scene, and that would be like a cool thing, but that was not me. I was like, the beginning, middle, and end of my understanding of that was the ironically purchased Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and Groove Is in the Heart. And I remember realizing that the person who does the rap on that song is Q-Tip.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, it's all starting to come together now. It's such a fascinating thing to think about, like who you were before you are who, I don't know. And then and I think that's the thing that I'm coming around to more now, is that I think maybe when you reach a certain age on the other side of it, all of a sudden I can feel the folds in my brain being like, remember this shit? Like, remember how much you were into Permanent Vacation by Aerosmith or like, just the stuff. Yeah. I don't know. Like all of a sudden, it feels like all of a sudden there's room for it. Maybe that's the thing. It's like all of a sudden you clear out some you're no longer doing a lot of gatekeeping, and you're no longer doing a lot of like worrying about why girls are don't like you, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I remember Talk.
And I think it's easier with film and TV, and I think and the unfortunate thing is, a lot of people harken back to like 80s movies and TV's shows with like with a sense of irony, but I loved shitty movies in the 80s because especially like the horror ones, because they were fucking scary and gross, and
I remember the time before irony, man. Remember when you just liked things and you just did it, like, it was like cool. You didn't have to wear like an Ashley Judd t-shirt. You could just wear a t-shirt of a band that you like. It's I always had trouble with the idea, like I always think of myself as this very it's another word for mediocre, but I really mean a medium person, where I never felt like I was like the funniest guy in the room, or the smartest guy in the room, or the guy with the impeccable taste. I was always the guy who was sort of absorbing things. So for that reason, I always had very little truck for like purposely watching the worst fucking movies possible, because it's like funny to like I have a certain amount of patience for that. And I'm like, no, I just kind of want to watch Fletch, like a pretty good movie that everybody can enjoy.
Police Academy.
Like I could say, that's funny. I remember some funny Kevin and Mark LeBeau story. We were at me and Kevin lived in an apartment on the east side of Providence, and it was like, the days before streaming. It was just like, I think we had the most basic cable that you could have. And we were desperately looking, like, on our 5th run through channels, trying to find something. And the movie the movie War of the Roses was just
Danny
starting.
DeVito?
Danny DeVito, like it was like the guys from Romancing the Stone, but they're set in a different, And I mean, that movie, War of the Roses is a perfect movie, a perfect example of is it a good movie? No, but we've circumvented the channels. Circumnavigated the channels. 6 times. Nothing. We land on War of the Roses, and I got a little too enthused. I was like, War of the Roses, dude, and I've been living that down. Man. I've been living that down for 20 years. Like, why don't we watch War of the fucking Roses? I'm like, that's it. It works. It would take up 2 hours while we eat Doritos and drink Cokes.
The
I
same
love that
this
stuff.
Yeah, and the same thing goes back to music too. If you have like a playlist, like I have playlists like called like party. So if I was having people over, I would put this thing on, and then just at one point one song will come, because I'm always try to put stuff on that like everyone will like,
Right.
and nothing that's too, obnoxious or whatever. But every once in a while, like one song will come on, and you'll just see like people like, what is this? Like Chuck Man, like what is this?
What do you think?
Like,
Is this Baker Street? Are we listening
right?
to Baker Street right now?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's got a cool sax part. I don't know what to tell
yeah,
you. Yeah, I will tell you. Living when I at the years that I lived with Kevin Cafferty,
yeah,
he was, holy shit. He had more good taste in music
yeah.
than I like. It was like, I mean, I will admit it fully. Like I was a bad borrower. I would borrow his CDs, and
Yeah,
they
you
would just
mentioned that
every.
before, I think.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I think I
yeah,
did. Like
yeah,
he had so much cool shit. I'd be
yeah,
like, well, the reason that I got into like, because Kevin was another one of those people who was like, when I met him, he was running with like punk rock kids, but
yeah, yeah,
he was into musical theater
yeah.
completely
Oh
unapologetically,
yeah,
and was the first person that I knew who dug like Ciba and
yeah, yeah,
fucking Bell and Sebastian
yeah,
and all that stuff, where I was like, I don't listen to this, and all of a sudden I'm listening to Bell and Sebastian, like, son of a bitch, why it's
yeah,
so good,
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, he was a fucking huge influence
yeah. I love
on that
his.
kind of stuff.
He's been doing those hot, like scary songs for October
Yeah, yeah,
little
yeah.
posts, and and that's, people shit on Facebook and this kind of thing, but like that's the stuff that like, I mean, political stuff is fine, whatever, but I'd rather have a thing that's got 1,700 comments about music or whatever,
Absolutely. Well,
in
that's
a
I
positive
think,
way too, not
yeah. Well,
like, hey, doesn't this band suck? Like,
that's the thing about Facebook.
yeah,
So it's funny, we kind of started here.
yeah, yeah,
And I think the thing that's, to me, that's been vastly informative and interesting about Facebook, when is that whole idea of Facebook behavior.
yeah,
3 months after I logged onto Facebook, I was like, oh, there's some certain behaviors, the
yeah,
vague posting thing, and
right, yeah,
where
yeah, yeah,
like you're like, oh, like if you could learn from other people's behavior
oh
about
yeah,
how not to be
oh yeah,
fucking incorrigible,
yeah, it's easy on there. It was
all of a
definitely easy,
sudden
man.
it was so easy. Like, and
Yeah,
so, and what I think the takeaway is, if you're being your authentic self,
yeah,
and writing and talking about things in your authentic voice on Facebook,
yeah,
it's way less cringy
yeah, yeah,
than when you're,
yeah, trying to,
like there's a certain tone that you're trying to
oh
like
yeah,
get
yeah,
across, and then you read it again, you're like, why was I talking like a 17th century
yeah,
carnival barker or whatever, like
I
whatever weird
yeah,
phase you go through. And so when all of that other stuff sort of falls away,
yeah,
and it just turns into, this is the stuff I'm interested in.
yeah,
There are guys like Kevin who are using it. That's what I think Facebook is for.
yeah, yeah, exactly,
Here are 30 days of spooky songs, and
right,
I watched an episode of every TV show
yeah, right,
from every
right,
year. And that stuff, to me,
yeah, I love
it's
that
like,
stuff.
that's the best thing.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, those are the people you want in your feed,
right. Or I'm such a sucker for those, like, make me choose between two
yeah,
bands,
yeah,
or
yeah,
here's the music I've listened to at the end of every
yeah,
year, or whatever.
right,
I love that stuff.
yeah,
And the cool thing is, because you learn, it's every kid has that moment. Every person, I think, has that moment. People of a certain disposition where you're being asked, like, what were you into when you were a kid?
right,
And there's a temptation to kind of cook the books.
oh yeah, yeah,
Like, I could say that I got that Velvet Underground record when I was 10,
right,
but I
right,
could leave out that I fucking hated it.
yeah,
I didn't
exactly,
get it at all.
yeah, of course,
And I think at some point, if you're a human being with like an actual soul, and
yeah,
like something that's actually animates you in your blood, you get to a point where you realize on Facebook, stop fucking doing that,
yeah,
and just say, I was listening to fucking Permanent Vacation when I
yeah,
was 11. You know what I mean?
right,
And
yeah,
it's a way more it's like the potential for Facebook, as evil as it is,
Mhm.
the potential to just actually have a conversation with
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
about the shit you're into is so,
Right.
it's such a huge, that's the same thing why, the same reason that I love Instagram is that it's
Yeah.
like you can just actually represent who you are
Yeah. Yeah.
in pictures
Right.
and not have it be editorialized.
Yeah.
And the people who I follow are always the people that are the least editorialized.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think maybe that's, so to come full circle, I think re-examining the stuff that you're into when you're, before you even realize that needs to be a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that, that's a huge thing where you can be like, oh, like for me, it's always about this weird, like because of my lack of self-confidence as a kid,
Yeah.
I found myself in a position where I was a bit of a storyteller.
Oh, yeah.
Or I was a bit of a, like you're trying to get some kind of credibility.
Yeah, of course.
So you say, like, for instance, when I was 12 or 13, I insisted I had seen the Dead Kennedys.
Yeah.
Of course I didn't fucking see the Dead Kennedys, but you're trying to get some foot in the door to be like, and all these years later, I think the best thing about Facebook is that it calls you out. Yeah. It's like, hey, remember 4.5 years ago when you insisted that you were listening to Can, and and like, no, you were listening to LL Cool J, man. That's all right. Like, it's cool.
Yeah, I always look at the 2 years ago today, 10, and when it gets into like the 8 years ago today, 10, there's like, I always am deleting stuff. I'm like,
it's hard to see it, man.
Yeah, I'm using like broads and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I really use
my God.
broads.
So, it's like funny. Kevin and I talk about that a lot on the Gleaming the Tube podcast, where some things just like you hear something that was like totally acceptable, as a joke, even a few years ago, and you hear it now, and you're like, it's like, some people would insist that it's like woke bullshit. Yeah. But you should get a shiver up your spine.
Oh yeah.
When you hear like, whoa, like Bradley Cooper uses the pejorative term for a homosexual. Yeah. In the trailer to the original. Right. Like, what the fuck? Like, what was going on? Did you read that awesome article Steve Albini wrote about that? Yeah. 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 I love the idea that he was like, it was the 90s. We were all these fucking edgelords who thought we were living in like a post-racial society.
He's become a much likable person in the last few years.
And I mean, again, isn't that what we're talking about? You reach a certain point where you're like, what the fuck? Like, what was I thinking? Yeah. And I think that so if there is a useful thing about Facebook, maybe it's just that. Yeah. Maybe it's an entire, because I know it's only 40-year-olds who use Facebook. I know. But maybe it's an entire generation of people in their mid 40s going like, oh man, I really am an idiot every 3 years, and maybe I should just shut up, Yeah.
I know. My first few years on there, I was very putting out like a curmudgeonly vibe.
Sure.
And my girlfriend at the time used to say, you're not like that, and people think that you're actually like that. And she's like, it kind of bugs me. So that's weird, when I kind of moved more into like, maybe just make jokes and try to have, every once in a while that stuff comes out, but I try, because I'm not a curmudgeon,
Right. Well, I remember there's one that came up. It was one of the same. It was exactly that same deal. It was like, list 5 or 10 bands you hate. Yeah. I dug right into that. Like, fuck. I was Hall and Oates. And a couple of years later, I read it. I was like, what the, like, why would you have spent all that? Like, I wrote like a dissertation about each band. And then a couple of years later, I'm like, do you really have that strong of an opinion about fucking Hall and Oates? And as a matter of fact, are Hall and Oates not actually kind of awesome?
Like, Do you really didn't like Hall and Oates?
It was, it's that's the funniest thing about like a public forum like that is I think I was not making the differentiation between people who were really into Hall and Oates, ironically. Yeah. And the fact that Hall & Oates actually made some really fucking good records. Yeah. And so it's funny. It's like, remember when you could be an expert on anything? Yeah. Because there was no internet to call you out. So you could just make some fucking claim. Yeah. And, maybe there would be somebody who knew more about what they were talking about in the room. But mostly if you just assume the position of a fucking expert, nobody would really And then all of a sudden on Facebook, it was like, no, I can Google this right now.
Yeah.
And so to me, like that's kind of awesome that like that it's like if you can exhibit kind of a learning curve with that stuff and be like, you shouldn't be that kind of person.
Yeah. No, I know.
Then there is something worthwhile about Facebook, right?
Yeah.
And
I do enjoy when it like going back like Weird Al Yankovic, which I do like him, but at one point in my life I made some negative post about him just to, like I usually like to like poke people, and people came out like were angry. Like, I think I put something like, I never listened to Weird Al Yankovic because I was too busy listening to actual music or something like that.
Sure.
And these, like, people were like, you fucking, and I'm like,
yeah.
And every few years I would revisit that, like, Weird Al sucked,
It's well, isn't it funny? Like, it's funny that like you like whatever like that weird synapse that you get a little attention online.
Yeah.
And you like it, or you start to like kind of crave it. I admit I went through that, but I was still actively tattooing. I went through. We actually kind of talked about this on the first episode I did, where I had kind of had a breakthrough. Yeah. And I was drawing some weird, cool shit for the first time.
Yeah.
I was really drawing stuff that was like sort of my true voice.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then that's great. But I also admit that I kind of got weirdly addicted to the approval, the chorus of approval. Like, you're a genius. It's like, I'm glad people are finally starting to figure that out, but it's not a sustainable thing.
Yeah. No.
And as long as you sort of get what you need from it, and then I love the idea of recognizing the pattern and be like, oh, like I remember one of I remember Kevin taking me aside. Where were we? We were at some show, and I forgot what the circumstances was, but Kevin, it was like maybe this is like 2010. So let's call it like 2.5, 3 years of Facebook presence.
Right.
And Kevin Cafferty was like, hey, Mike, what's with the fucking spelling errors? And it was a thing. It like didn't occur to me that it would matter.
Right.
But there is a spell check on your computer. And why are you doing these posts that are like riddled with spelling errors? You're smarter than that. But I was like, that doesn't matter. And he was like, oh, I want you to trust me. It does. and I was like, okay, man. Like, and I think it was like, that was kind of almost like before you would see a post from I don't know when they started doing that.
Right.
But a couple of years later, all of a sudden I would start to see posts and I was like, oh my God, I look like I'm typing with boxing gloves on.
Right.
What is wrong with me?
Yeah.
But you notice the pattern and then you and then you shift it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So what have we learned?
I know, right?
Talk. Weird Al Yankovic.
Weird Al Yankovic. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like the other stuff that I was super, Legos was one of those things.
Oh yeah.
I hung on to Legos.
Yeah.
Well past, because you just build a fucking spaceship and then you get a spaceship, and then one day you decide, well, I gotta put the Legos away. I was really lucky in that skateboarding when I first, it was a toy.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I sort of discovered this entire culture that was built around it. So I could really, kind of lean into that.
Right. Yeah.
But like, it doesn't mean I also wasn't super into like BMX and
right.
And I don't know.
Yeah.
All that, just that kid stuff.
Yeah.
Ed Emberley. Did you ever hear of Ed Emberley?
No.
Ed Emberley was this guy. He's from Massachusetts, and he would do drawing instruction books.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all step by step.
Yeah.
Like just make a shape and another shape. And I remember, like, I think that was a source of material for like how I drew.
Yeah.
Well into my teens.
Oh, nice.
Totally forgot about it. And then recently was like, oh yeah. I think I found one of his books in a bookstore and I was like, holy shit. I was like, this was like the crucible to me.
Yeah.
And then I forgot completely about it for 30 years. It's weird.
That happened to me with my dad used to buy those books by that guy, B. Kleiben, the Cats guy.
Oh yeah.
But then he also did these like just weird, surreal, like funny, just comic books. And I think he had like 5 or 6 collections, and they were just like weird. Like one of them was called like "Never Eat Anything Bigger Than Your Head." They were just cool drawings, and but I completely forgot about him. And then same thing I found at like a
Yeah.
bookstore, and I was like, oh shit, we used to read these, and I ended up buying all of them online, and
Right. I
it just
almost
brings back a lot
wonder.
of stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if what we're taught. I would love to like run this by like a psychologist,
Yeah,
and I wonder if that's like an actual phenomenon where when
yeah,
you hit a certain age, maybe that's like what people think of as like a midlife crisis.
yeah,
But what it really is just you being like, oh yeah, I used to fucking love that.
yeah, yeah. And
Remember? Yeah,
I
and
don't
it's
remember
not
who.
nostalgia.
No, it's not.
It's
Yeah,
just like the re-unearthing of like the stuff. I guess that the term that I would use is your most authentic self
yeah,
before you
yeah,
decided you
yeah,
wanted to be cool.
yeah, yeah. I
That was
think a
just the
lot of it
stuff you were
is.
into.
Yeah, and I feel like some of it is like not reliving your youth, but like you had a certain comfort in your room where you had like,
Yeah,
there's my books and my fucking little statues or whatever in this, and I feel like going back to that
yeah,
just kind of gives you like this comfort or whatever, even if it is like, a 40, the guy in his 50s, like, you know,
right.
watching
Well,
Scooby Doo.
isn't it funny that what we're the other thing I think we're now touching on is that there is a certain amount of time that you spend alone when you're a kid.
Yeah.
Like you play with your friends outside or you
Mhm.
play action figures with your friends, but the way that you play with that stuff alone is a really different thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so maybe it's like almost like it's like you're uncovering that, like that again, your authentic self when you're not there's not an audience, there's not
Right.
someone
Right.
else there, it's
Yeah.
you alone in your room.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, I committed myself I was going to learn every single word of License to Ill.
Yeah.
And so for 3 weeks I probably sat in my room with the tape and like paused it and
Right.
and like why
Yeah.
was I doing that? I don't know, because I was a 12 and
Yeah.
I was bored, right? I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah, there's something elemental about that.
Yeah. And we talked too about at one point starting to listen to music like that you really weren't, it wasn't cool, like Steely Dan. That was
Yeah,
one of
yeah.
those, like, and how that came up was might have been the last time we saw each other. You tattooed the Iron Maiden guy on
Yeah,
my
yeah.
arm, and my girlfriend. And when you and I were setting up the appointment, at the end of one of the messages said, "Oh, by the way, I've been listening to a lot of Steely Dan lately." And I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
cool, man."
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
like, "Oh, we'll have to talk about that when I." And you
Yeah,
said
that
your favorite album at that time was "Can't Buy a Thrill." Is that still your
I
go-to with
think
them?
that's the one with Do It Again on it. That's like
Yeah,
with the
yeah,
other singer. Yeah, I
yeah. The other
like
singer. Yeah,
I mean, honestly, now I admit it. I just like the greatest hits.
yeah. Right.
I think I put it on shuffle, and
Yeah,
I'm constantly surprised. I certainly have songs I don't like. I don't like
yeah,
Shiva. That song
yeah,
sucks ass.
yeah, yeah,
But but again, I think it's funny because at the time, not to get my father had, I don't know if you know, my father died of COVID,
yeah, yeah.
and uh I was quarantined in the house because
Yeah.
I had gotten it too.
Hmm.
And I was just in my childhood home
Yeah.
under some pretty terrible,
Oh yeah.
traumatic circumstances.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I just was like, I'm going to fucking listen to Steely Dan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And God, did I have a moment? I was like,
Yeah.
holy, because it's like, my mother had been gone for about 10 years at that point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was just like reconnecting. I think, my brain was maybe just trying to reconnect with something in some
Oh
small
yeah.
way.
Yeah, definitely.
And man, did that open a door. I was like, this is,
Yeah.
it's funny because it's like, I didn't go much further than that. My
Yeah.
mom was into a bunch of stuff that I don't know that I would say, like she was into like a lot of the later Van Morrison stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Maybe when I'm 55, I'll be like, later Van Morrison is amazing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I was kind of. It's funny. I was kind of like hoping that Steely Dan would be the last,
One of those.
the last indignity I would have to endure. Where I'm like, fuck, I gotta like these guys now.
I know.
Shit.
I know. I just started like in my 50s, started getting comfortable, like just talking about being into the Grateful Dead and Fish and stuff like that, because that's something, especially in our worlds,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
gets looked down upon.
Well,
A lot of it's the fans and
yeah. Well, it's fun. That's the Dead are a perfect example of. There's that whole sort of larger world attached.
Yeah.
That through a certain lens could be considered a very lame thing indeed.
Yeah.
But I made that post about I watched that 6-part Dead documentary, and I was like, you come out of the other side thinking, well, shit, like, isn't that the most punk rock thing in the world? Like, they just did what they wanted to do for 50 years and never, like they delivered a couple of hits and a couple of live albums that sold well, and they wanted to make a mountain out of amplifiers and trek it across Europe, and that's what they fucking did. Like it's like that's kind of one of the more punk rock things you could do, really. Like, and so but there's so much attached to that. You mentioned that you're into the Dead, and but obviously I've never seen the Dead live, and I don't really have. Maybe to me the biggest takeaway of this sort of point in my life is that it's that the lack of necessity to turn these things into a thing. That I have to, you know what I mean? That I now have to like talk
you don't have
constantly.
to become
I could just be like,
a couple Grateful Dead songs.
Like the Dead, There's a certain moment where I feel like early Dead and latter day Velvet Underground kind of touch, like those two worlds kind of cross. If you like Loaded, you like American Beauty, and vice versa. And so if you can make the space for that, the same thing with Rush. A few years ago, I did one of the nerdiest fucking music things I ever did. For an entire year, I only listened to music that came out on the year I was born.
Oh, yeah.
In chronological order.
So 78?
74.
74, okay.
So it was a lot.
74 was a good year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, man. A lot of stuff was really surprising.
Yeah.
I was very surprised by how unbelievable Grand Funk Railroad's Survival is. Holy shit, that record is and there's a lot of really great stuff. Tangerine Dream.
Yeah. I
think Diamond Dogs came out.
Yeah.
But one of the things, again, same thing. I learned that I'm kind of a fan of Rush, you know, like that. I think it's the first Rush album came out in 74. And it's a very blues rock affair.
Oh yeah.
But of all, cause it's like, I was working on a bit of a budget. So I was buying like cutout bin price CDs of whatever I could that came out of that year. And man, that Rush CD took quite a ride with me for a while. Cause I was like, there's a lot to unpack here. And it's, it's funny. I think the other thing too is, I'll watch a documentary about any band or anything. And when you watch I watched that Rush documentary. And how you can come out the other side of watching that documentary and not at least have an affection.
For those guys.
For like, I made the sort of the connection where in a lot of ways Rush are really like They Might Be Giants. Where they just make the fucking music they want to hear. They have an audience. They're of a certain breed of type of person. And they sort of don't need to make many apologies for what exactly that is. And once you can start to kind of experience things that way and not have to have that deeply ingrained there. I know dudes who are like aging punk rock guys in their 50s who still insist that like you can't listen to Pink Floyd.
Oh, I know.
And that like the Doors and it's like, dude, I mean, I'm not saying you have to like the Doors, but it's like the 13-year-old kid who decides he's too punk rock to like the Beatles and then never revisits that. It's like, well, are you sure? Or is it just one of those things that you've been saying since you were 15 and you never,
Guys like that still use that argument where they're like, no, man, Pink, that's the stuff punk rock fought against. And I'm like, well, that's great for punk rock, but I'm 52 now. Like, I want to listen. Like,
couldn't I just listen to Rush?
Like at this point, I don't care. Like
the idea that I saw it recently. Somebody made a post about the sorry, never mind the Bullocks. And again, that record had no impact on me when I was a kid. It sounded sort of slow and boring to me as a kid. Because I wanted to hear
Yeah,
fucking
Dead
Dead Kennedys,
Yeah.
play Drug Me,
Yeah.
and then play, Never Mind the Bollocks, and
Right.
it just doesn't. But the thing is, over the years, I have a really hard time with people whose opinions are sort of these canned, like, pull
Right.
quotes
Oh yeah,
from the
it's
one
the
article they
same.
read. And
Yeah.
recently on Facebook, I heard a 50-something-year-old man say that was dying on the hill that the Sex Pistols were like the first boy band. And I was like, dude, you read that in Spin in 1992, and you've just been regurgitating that dog shit, completely inaccurate opinion because it suits you. You don't have to think about it anymore. You've just said it. That weird conventional wisdom thing, which is, again, that comes back to Facebook behavior.
Yeah.
Come on, man. Right? There's got to be a learning curve.
I feel like this whole conversation's about social media and
it is a pervasive thing. And like I said, I think even the hatred of social media is something that there's a lot to hate. But once, if you can just decide to see it as more entertaining, and as a weird social experiment, it really is vastly entertaining.
Oh yeah. And also, like, you do the podcast with Kevin, and I do this one, and if we didn't have Facebook or social media, who the fuck would ever even know it? You would tell some, imagine word of mouth podcasting, or
our 9 listeners would be cut down to 3 or 4.
It would be like our friends. You'd be like, oh, my aunt listened to me and my friends talk about Steely Dan for an hour. Like, okay.
That was great. What the fuck are you talking about?
Right.
That's good stuff, man.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's great to catch up, dude.
Yeah, I know. Awesome. Thank you for doing this again, Mike.
Yeah, man. It was great to catch up.
Yeah.
It's always fun to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I will talk to you soon.
Yes, please.
Awesome.
See you later. Bye-bye.